Hi, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. Chicago Newsroom, we talk about journalism and things like that, and we're going to talk exactly about that today, the future of journalism. Now, it's important to emphasize that we're talking today about journalism and not necessarily the newspapers, the magazines, radio, TV stations, and all those places where journalism is found. What we're going to be talking about today is something we all know about. The media is going through wrenching changes. There's a lot of the media landscape as we know it that's just probably not even going to survive the next few years. But there is a real concern, and that concern is the people who gather, report, edit, and present the important news about our society. They're losing their jobs. The landscape is changing a lot, and there are plenty of people who say this could actually be a threat, literally a threat to our democracy. There's a new book we want you to know about. It's called The Death and Life of American Journalism. It takes on the topic in a very new way, and we're very pleased today to have the co-authors of this book with us today. Robert McChesney is the author of several books on media and politics and a professor of communications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bob, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here.
And co-author John Nichols is with us today. He writes for The Nation magazine as its Washington correspondent. John and Robert are co-founders of the media reform organization Free Press, among other things. Busy guys, these guys. And also joining us today is Steve Rhodes. He's a journalist and blogger and proprietor of the Beachwood Reporter here in Chicago. Steve's a really good example of new media because he's someone who worked for years in mainstream media. He was an MSM guy, and then he found his way into the new media economy as a blogger and the proprietor of the Beachwood Reporter. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I want to welcome everybody to Chicago Newsroom. And guys, first of all, thanks for writing this book. It's a very important book, and really hope that it'll catch some attention. The biggest problem that we're going to have here today is we only have about 29 minutes, and we have to solve one of the most intractable problems in our society in just a few minutes. So
if we do it in just a few, can we then go to healthcare?
I think. Well, I would like that. Let's do 15 minutes and 15 minutes either way. I was hoping that maybe we could sort of dispense, as they say in Congress, we could just kind of like stipulate that we know there's lots of problems with the newspapers and with magazines and TV. We know all that. Let's kind of start in the middle and talk about where do we go from the mess that we find ourselves in right now. And I wondered if maybe we could start with sort of laying out the number of solutions that people have tried to come up with, and that so far at least nobody's come up with the silver bullet, unless maybe you guys have it, and that's why we're here today.
Well, I think the place to start is that a year ago when this crisis really hit, because the profits for these news media and corporations went through the floor and they were closing newspapers and they've been laying off journalists, closing bureaus, I think the dominant response was, well, we just have to hope these guys can start making money again so they can hire journalists again. And they might not be able to do it in old media, we understand that, but someone online is going to figure out there's a way you can go online and we can come up with enough advertising support or other forms of support that we can recreate what we've lost and maybe surpass it. And I think what we demonstrate in our book, and I think the evidence is now clear, is that going online isn't going to magically produce the resources to employ 100,000 people and have newsrooms and competing newsrooms covering this community, our communities around in Chicago and around the country. If we're going to do it, we're going to have to face up to the fact that journalism, as we've known it, is no longer a profitable undertaking. It's no longer something that the market will produce in sufficient quantities. We can debate the quality, but it will produce enough quantity. I think the evidence is now clear. There will be some journalism thanks to the market. There will be some journalism that advertising will support. There will be some journalism that will find people willing to pay for it. But it will get us at most to the 10-yard line, the wrong 10-yard line.
Yeah.
It'll leave a huge gap of uncovered communities, uncovered government, uncovered elections, uncovered politics, and we can't survive in that situation.
Now, there is one, I just want to take us down a very short cul-de-sac here because, Steve, I know you've talked about this in the past. Journalism is no longer profitable, but journalism never was profitable. Journalism never was, right?
Right. The news never paid for itself, and I think that there's kind of this rush of people to try to figure out how can we make the news pay, and people are coming up with all kinds of crazy ideas to kind of commodify the news and get people to pay for it. But the Metro section at the Tribune never paid for itself. That's why you had travel, real estate, the classifieds, and those sorts of things. So, but I think actually there are a lot of success stories on the web going online. I think that is a place where money can be made, but not with a model that is simply the news, is simply neighborhoods, communities, because that's never worked. So, but there are other examples of
because
things
the
out
news
there.
was something that was sort of protected inside the belly of the beast. There was this
Right.
huge commercial operation going on around it, and
Well-
they allowed the news to happen as long as it didn't upset the boat.
Essentially, I mean, the networks were really network news. Those were cost centers, but they were done for the idea of the public interest and the prestige. Now, newspapers always made money. It wasn't necessarily the journalism.
Right,
Why do we have horoscopes and crossword puzzles and comics? And so I don't see why. I mean, today online, digital and video games could be the new version of the
pornography's doing great.
Well, pornography's doing great too, but look at the Chicago Reader or alternative weeklies across the country, which have always been free, supported by, speaking of pornography, a lot of sex ads and that sort of thing in the back too. So I actually think that that following the same model actually is what's proving successful online.
Well, John, that's an interesting aside, and it's good for a chuckle. But from what I'm hearing, even the porn guys are having problems too.
I'm not overly
that
worried.
industry is
I want to
suffering.
defend their business model. I think is still surprisingly good. The internet's ingenious for pornography because, of course, you didn't really want to go to that sleazy store. When you can just get it online, it's great. And that's sort of the problem, though, with any kind of journalism online. And in the book, we spent an immense amount of time interviewing all kinds of producers, all kinds of innovators, and not just in the United States, but around the world, because we were saying, can anybody show us a place where journalism can make it? And everything that Steve's saying is correct. The problem, though, is that in the old newspaper, as a model, we don't even worry about television and radio, because that's just basically weather and some crime reporting, right?
And a bunch of stuff they swipe from the newspaper.
And it's swiped from the newspaper. And we honor it, because they used to try, but since the Telecom Act of '96, they pretty much,
gave up
they
on
ceded that term.
It wasn't worth the time.
And so, let's talk about the newspaper. The genius of the newspaper, and the reason the advertiser went to it, was because as you're flipping through it, you'd be reading about Afghanistan, then you go, oh, I can get some new underwear. Great. Okay. Then you flip to the next page, etc. The challenge of the internet is that when you go to a website, a news website, or even something that's more community-oriented, something that really stretches the limits, if there is an ad there, the job of the person who's designed that ad is to get you to click on it. When you click on it, you leave. It's as if the underwear ad on the bottom of the page took you out of the newspaper, folded up the newspaper, put it aside, and said, don't go back there. We'll show you something better over here. We'll have underwear models. And so what we did was we talked to people who are some of the best innovators in the world. We said, how's this going to work? How are we going to make some money online? And what was fascinating to us is every serious player said, you won't. It's not going to happen. Journalism.
Okay, well,
coverage
thanks
of
for
politics.
joining us today. There's really no need to go on.
No, but the coverage
why do you
of
have
politics.
to click on that ad? You didn't have to click on the ad in the newspaper.
No.
I mean, that's not...
But you saw the
I mean,
ad. I'm just to tell you that this is what everybody tells us, and it's believe me, I don't claim to be smart enough.
Bob everyone
Garfield,
in the newspaper industry.
No,
because
the top advertising folks. Bob Garfield, who is has been writing for Ad Age forever, has written a book called Chaos, where he says it's absolutely gone. That advertising will no longer support journalism. Period. It's done.
In any form, whether it's online or...
And then so we talked to the people at The Guardian in London who have what's arguably, generally thought of as the best journalism website, news website in the world. And we said, you guys are doing great. You got all this. You've been the great innovators for a better part of 20 years. And that you must, how's it working? How's it good? The guy said, well, we're losing about 30 million pounds a year. We're run by a charitable trust, and it's, that keeps us going. The truth of the matter is we literally went everywhere because we wanted to find model. We'd love to hold up a model that worked. It's not happening, period. It's not going to happen. If we follow that fantasy, we will lose 5, 10, 20 years waiting for a messiah to appear.
Specifically, the fantasy you're talking about is that
an
online will begin to support itself if we just give it enough time.
So Gawker isn't making millions of dollars? Is Nick Denton lying? Or,
the fascinating thing is
Politico talking
Politico's losing money like crazy. Yeah.
They're profitable.
Yeah, because they have a print publication.
What's wrong with that model?
There's nothing wrong with it. They have a print publication that they print out that they put out on the street for free that is full of defense industry ads. And in fact, what I will tell you is that even when we talk about, and I respect your models, that you may find a national, we read a lot about Drudge. Drudge makes some money. Oh. We read about these national models. We say, well, that's great. That's wonderful. But this whole discussion about how to save journalism has been so Washington-centric, so New York-centric. We're talking about Keokuk, Iowa. We're talking about all these places across America and asking the question, can we really have a serious journalism in communities across this country, underserved, neglected communities that mainstream media did a rotten job of covering? Can we do it? And what we're finding when we go to those communities, as well as when we talk to the top experts in the world, the answer is no, it's not going to happen in advertising supported. It's just not going to happen.
This is really interesting, and again, I don't want to get us too far off track, again, because we have so much to cover here, but I mean, I think it's interesting to point out that those of us who've sort of labored in public broadcasting and community activity, stuff like this, I think we've all held the position for forever that the mainstream media really wasn't doing the job of journalism anyway. I mean, some of it was being done accidentally, but to say who's going to cover that important, who's going to uncover that important thing in Keokuk, Iowa, well, you know what, it probably wasn't going to get done anyway. So in addition to trying to find this model for how to pay for it, we're also trying to see if it can actually be born.
Or do something better.
Do something better.
Well, I mean, the thing is to cut to the chase. The era of advertising-supported journalism was really only the last 100 years. It provided between 60 and 100% of the revenues of commercial news media, be it newspapers, news magazines, radio, or television. And that era is ending. It doesn't mean there isn't going to still be some advertising. There will be, but it won't be at the levels we're accustomed to. That's why we're seeing newspapers close. That's why we're seeing the number of journalists radically shrinking, because it's not a smart business move. The revenue isn't there to pay them. And I think what it leads us to look at is, well, then, if it's 100 years we've had roughly this sort of advertising era, and it's ending now, since advertisers have all these other ways to hit their target audience that have nothing to do with news. That's one of the options, but it's one of 1,000 options, not one of 2 options like it used to be. How did we have newspapers for the first 100 years in this country? We had the richest, most diverse news media in the world. Before advertising, it played this enormous role in providing all the revenues. And then in our book, what we demonstrate is that what we had in this country were massive and enormous government subsidies that created our press system, far beyond what anyone really recognized. And all the great historians who studied this, they did it in the 70s, 80s, and 90s before this crisis, and they thought it was sort of antiquarian interest. Oh, this is sort of interesting that the government actually paid what today would be tens of billions of dollars annually to create a press system, but that was then. We don't have to worry about that now. But now that our press system is disintegrating and our journalism is collapsing, at least the resources to independent competing newsrooms, that history takes on a new light. Because what we learned in our book is that the founders of this republic had 2 complementary visions of what freedom of the press means. On one hand, it means there should be no government censorship of the news, no government regulation of journalists, no government stopping people wanting to do news media, something we absolutely agree with. But that's only half of the free press tradition in the United States. The other half was the belief of Madison and Jefferson, all the founders, undebated for 100 years, that the first duty of the government was to make sure you had a free press.
That it was
it existed.
It was an equal and sort of bilateral.
If you didn't have a fourth estate that was credible, that had resources, the right to not have it censored was irrelevant. You had to have it in the first place, and those weren't seen as contradictory.
Almost as though the government can't really exist unless it coexists.
Absolutely.
But it's more than that. It's the infrastructure of democracy. And remember that the founders, very flawed individuals in a lot of ways, but they were men of the Enlightenment, and they believed that ideas, even ideas they disagreed with, had value, that you might be born with one mindset and die with a very different one. They had experienced that themselves.
Whatever happened to that?
Well, we've just about killed it off. I think we've done pretty good.
Much gone, right?
But
you might have a good point there. I don't think I've ever heard that.
Part of what they sought to create is actually now, because of what you're doing, this is why we can now return to the founding moment, because the internet, the digital experience, does allow for the creation of media, for the creation of journalism, at a relatively lower cost. You don't have to hire all the trucks and do all that. So we've got a lot of possibility here. But what we do have to do is figure out how to get resources, or at least some structural support, to all the people that want to do it. What the founders understood was that if you made it your support content neutral, you didn't back one side against the other guy, let some senator say, I don't like what this guy's saying over there in Chicago. If you make it content neutral, and if you really do have as your underpinning value the idea that you should have a lot of media, a lot of journalism, a lot of dissenting views, that speaking truth to power, that challenging authority is a valid and good part of the civic discourse. Now, if you just get into that game and you give a lot of the power to people themselves, perhaps through a citizen news voucher where they can actually support a local media outlet that they think is doing a good job covering their community, this is where we take the genius of the founders, as well as, frankly, some ideas from our libertarian buddies, who say, let's give everybody a little resources. Don't get the government in there deciding, let's save the Chicago Tribune. Let's let citizens in a neighborhood say that we want Beachwood News to flourish because it's in our community. We're going to sustain it. And the government, though, through either a voucher that people can use or through a tax, something you write off your taxes as they do in some Scandinavian countries, allows this to happen. These are not particularly radical ideas. These are practical ideas that solve a fundamental problem right now.
Wait a minute. You're saying pass some kind of a tax or some kind of financial support to journalism, and then that's not a particularly radical idea?
Not really.
I'd like to pitch that one to Mitch McConnell, see what he has to say about that.
Well, maybe,
I'd like to see that one treated on the Fox
Mitch
News.
McConnell might be the radical then, because it's our history. The first 100 years of this country, we computed, we went back and actually looked at the government data and consulted economists. What would be we looked at the postal and printing subsidies that built our press system in the first 100 years of American history, and we computed what the federal government have to spend today is the same percentage of GDP to subsidize journalism and public media compared to what we did in the 1840s. And the federal government today would have to spend $30 billion to have a comparable impact to what it did in the 1840s. And then what we did is we looked at other democracies. Oftentimes people say, well, if you have the government subsidize journalism, invariably you're going to look like Stalin's Pravda or Pol Pot's Cambodia.
I think Idi Amin's
or Idi Amin's Uganda. That's you're going to end up there very quickly.
That's big government. When big government taking over health insurance, now you want big government to take over journalism.
But then we said, why don't we look at the other countries that maybe have a little bit more in common with us, that are democracies, that have legal political parties, that are oppositional, that have constitutions, that have advanced economies, and see what they're doing instead of looking at Pol Pot's Cambodia. So why not look at Canada, Britain, Germany, Norway, Japan, South Korea, Switzerland, Norway, the works of Europe. And what we find is almost all those countries have huge subsidies of public media and journalism compared to us. I mean, on a per capita basis, at least 20 times higher, sometimes as much as 75 or 80 times higher. So other democracies get it. Other democracies get it that you can't just leave it to the market and hope advertisers are willing to bankroll your journalism. And if they don't, well, too bad, you roll up the carpet and say, we're done with democracy. They get it that it's part of the infrastructure of democracy.
And let me tell you something, one cool thing. Don't take it from us. Take it from The Economist magazine, which is not exactly a left-wing publication. They do an annual democracy survey. They look around the world. They say, what are the freest countries in the world? Where's the discourse going on? Where's democracy working? Where is it happening? And I hate to report that the good old USA is not number one. The countries that are number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, the places with the most highly subsidized media. And then you go to Freedom House. This is the folks established by media folks who want to look around the world and say, where is the freest commercial press? Not public TV, but commercial media. Where's old-fashioned for-profit newspapers, the freest in the world? And they are tough analysts. Every communist country, every dictatorship is at the bottom of the list. Even democracies where the government might look askance at some publication goes down the list. Who's at the top? Where do you have the freest media, according to really a very conservative analysis of this? Norway, Sweden, Finland, the places with this heavy subsidy. So the fact of the matter is the evidence is in, both from our own history and from around the world. It is possible to create subsidies that sustain and indeed enhance journalism without undermining freedom of the press and in a way that actually makes your democracy far more functional.
I think what's interesting about this to me is the idea that over the last 100 or 200 years we've sort of resolved in our minds as a democracy the idea that the free market, there are certain things the free market just simply can't do. It doesn't do a very good job of moving poor people around in transportation. It doesn't take care of their health needs very well. We could go on. It often doesn't provide housing very well. And now we've added to that list, it doesn't do journalism. I mean, the free market really doesn't do journalism. Journalism can latch onto it, can sort of like go for the free ride if there's lots of money sloshing around. But when that money isn't there anymore, you get into trouble. And we can't afford to let this vital function of democracy just sort of fall to the wayside because, well, the big media companies have blown up.
Have you read our book?
Yes.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
teasing. I'd say that's basically our concept.
But well,
and by the way, we should mention that this is a very interesting book, and we do have the authors of both books. Steve Rhodes is here from the Beachwood Reporter here in Chicago. John Nichols, who you just heard from, and Bob McChesney are both here. The Death and the Life of Journalism. It's available now. It actually just came out a little while ago, right?
Yeah.
What was Steve saying?
Well, I agree, and I'm hardly a Mr. Free market advocate. I think a lot of that is bunk. But I think, again, the market doesn't support news, but it can support a lot of other things. And there are other alternatives too, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you dismiss in your book, whether it's the nonprofit model or the billionaire philanthropist model. I don't know what's wrong with that model either. I mean, in the last 100 years, a lot of newspapers were basically run and owned by billionaire philanthropists who were willing to lose money to do their thing.
That's a very good point.
And so there's a variety of different models and different ways to go. I don't know why.
Well, we looked at that because that's absolutely one.
So what about billionaire philanthropy?
It's one of the core issues we looked at. John and I, working with Free Press and other things, have dealt with not as many billionaire, but say 100 millionaire philanthropists and a couple of billionaires.
We take their calls.
And we work also with all sorts of websites that are trying to do journalism. They're desperate for support from philanthropists too. And one of the things we've been looking at is how realistic is it that we're going to get support from extraordinarily wealthy foundations or individuals to bankroll journalism? What can we hope for? And we actually looked at the hard numbers of what's actually been given and what the prospects are for growth. And we think there's some promising signs there. We think it's possible that there will be a handful of newspapers that some wealthy person will take over and be willing to run at a loss and provide a service to the community. We don't rule that out. We think, though, looking at the numbers, realistically, the percentage of our journalism that could be covered by that with the pool of money out there and what the historical record shows and the recent record shows is still relatively small. And we encourage that. We do nothing to discourage that. But we think if we're going to sit around and think that's going to get us out of the woods, we're dreaming. We should encourage that. But
there's a severe billionaire shortage.
Let me give you an example.
I
was going to say, the Tribune Company missed a big opportunity when they ended up selling to Sam Zell to be at the forefront of this kind of thing, because there were civic leaders and philanthropists in many Tribune markets, whether it was Los Angeles, Newsday,
Eli
Hartford,
Broad in Los
Baltimore,
Angeles.
exactly,
Yes,
who were all dying to have the Tribune sell those papers to them. So right in one fell swoop, it could have taken care of a lot. I'm not saying it's going to take care of all in every market, but I don't know why that wouldn't be one piece of the puzzle.
Your point is a very good one. No, your point is a good one. And in our book, we actually encourage, we say there's nothing that we're proposing that would actually get in the way of this. In fact, we are actually, one of the proposals in our book suggests that we should actually get in a game of making it easier. One thing that we explore is the idea that in a market where you have a local buyer, not just a billionaire philanthropist, we would like to actually think journalism might be the province of guys who wear tennis shoes, working guys, and so what we suggest is if you've got an owner who's running the paper into the ground, who's just laying off journalists, maybe even talking about closing it, and you could transition the ownership to local owners, perhaps a billionaire philanthropist, perhaps a cooperative, perhaps the union, some group of individuals in the town that are committed to it. And you can get some ironclad commitment there. We would love to see the Federal Small Business Administration or other agencies quarterbacking those sorts of sales. Perhaps, and we don't like this idea because we think we're not that big fan of the old media companies, but perhaps even allowing for some sort of tax write-off if you sell to a local owner who's committed to maintaining journalism.
Yes.
This is why we bring this up.
Bribe them to leave the
These
field.
are bribe them to get off the field. The bottom line here is we need to be looking at innovative ways to make sure there's journalism. We say no. There's nothing we say no to, but what we do say yes to is ways that we're going to try and get resources to journalists.
Guys, as always, the tyranny of the clock is upon us, and we've already blown our chance to solve the health care crisis. So let's try to see if we can get to a bottom line. You throw out some numbers, $30 billion. I mean, can you sort of summarize this? What do you think the numbers are?
Well, $30 billion is what other countries, advanced democracies, spend. It's what we spent in the 1840s. I don't think we necessarily have to spend that sort of money today because I think the internet does, for one thing, lower a lot of our costs dramatically, so that wouldn't be necessary. But one cost it doesn't lower is the cost of compensated, skilled human labor. That's the big thing that's not getting taken care of yet, and that's what we have to cover. So we can probably do it for less, but there are certain things we could do immediately that are shovel-ready to address the crisis. Ramp up the money for all forms of public, community, public access, low-power, student media, university media, with an emphasis to putting the money on local journalism. Get the money funds there. Secondly, we're about to lose a whole generation of kids who want to be journalists. We talk to them all the time. We can't afford to let that happen. Let's get a Right for America, a News AmeriCorps program, get 10, 20,000 kids on stipends for a year or two, send them out to the Beachwood Reporter, four of them working for you. Kids who desperately want to do journalism but can't get jobs. Let's force this country to have journalism and get great journalists out there and build a system to make sure they keep getting jobs. Those are the sort of things we can do right away.
So, let's get on it, huh?
All right. Well, no, what we will...
I'm really sorry to say that we have just managed to talk ourselves to the very end. I wish we had another half hour. It's a fascinating topic, but you can pick it up just by picking up the book and carrying on the conversation there. It's a fascinating topic, the future of journalism, the death and life of journalism. That's the name of the book. And you've been watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV, a community service of CAN TV. Now, you can find all of this here on cable, but you can also see this and all the other programs online that CAN TV does at Blip TV, cantv.blip.tv. Check us out here or subscribe using iTunes. It's the new world. It's the media, right? You can even get this online, and maybe they'll send us some money, too. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you very much for joining us, and everybody who's been on the panel today. We'll see you next time. Thanks.